Hi, KRB teachers. Welcome to week 4 in the Maximize Being the Best Version of Yourself webinar series. Today, we are focusing on classroom management and helping you to identify and manage behaviour challenges in the classroom. A reminder of the overall webinar series. And today, we are focusing on the first webinar in the modules, focusing on your relationship with your students. Getting started into the introduction, what are we going to be learning about today? Well, hopefully I can help you to understand and respond to disruptive and challenging behaviours in the classroom. What would today look like? We'll start with the context, then move on to what is classroom management, look at your style of classroom management, then go into challenging and disruptive behaviours in students, look at some general classroom management strategies and then some specific ones, and then finally give you an opportunity to reflect and think about your classroom management strategies going forward. So to start with the context, just running through this quite quickly, at a high level, the evolution of technology has obviously transformed the nature of the classroom. We used to have whiteboards, chalkboards, then projectors. Now we've got screens not only in the classroom, but on their students' phones, at home, laptops, tablets, iPads, etc. The impact of COVID took the classroom to just be an in-person, traditionally experience, to fully online for a while there. And now we've got this hybrid method of teaching, which of course makes the classroom experience quite different to what it used to look like. On top of that is the rise of mental illness in young people. We've looked at this in the last webinar series, so I would go back, suggest you to go back and have a look at that if you haven't already. But essentially, it's increasing at a very rapid rate in young people, mental illnesses, that is. Because of COVID as well, it's only amplified and exacerbated those rates, which is projected to rise to not only 2 in 5 now, but almost to 3 in 5 within the next 5 to 6 years. So what does that mean for you as teachers and the result? We've gone from classrooms when they've been quite straightforward in person, where students have been more or less engaged or easier to control and manage, to increasingly disengaged and disruptive students that seem to have their own flexibility, which is great in some ways, but also then have their own agenda and way to participate in the learning experience. So what is really classroom management now for you? It's essentially the actions that you take to create and maintain a productive and supporting learning environment for the academic and social emotional learning of students. There is, of course, effective classroom management and ineffective classroom management. On the one hand, effective classroom management is where there's productive teaching, which results in engaged and attentive students and ultimately higher academic achievement. On the other hand, ineffective classroom management is where there's unproductive teaching. There's disengaged and therefore disruptive students, also resulting in lower academic achievement. Over 40 years ago, classroom management was decided to be the one thing that makes or breaks teachers in research. Even more recently, classroom management still is a teacher's greatest concern. You may also find it interesting to know that 80% of disruptive student behaviour is due to poor classroom organisation, planning and teaching. So there's this two-way relationship between classroom management and student behaviour, such that poor classroom management can result in disruptive student behaviour, and vice versa, disruptive student behaviour can lead to then poor classroom management. But focusing on your style of management in the classroom is something that you can control and focus on. So that's what we want to look at today. A reminder that we looked in the last webinar series at different types of teaching styles. And ultimately, there is an axis between the level of control and warmth that's in the classroom that you exert as a teacher. The ideal is an authoritative teaching style, which is where you are in a high position of control, but also exerting a high degree of warmth on students. It results in firm but fair teaching. There's class discussions and there's engaged students. This results not only in productive classroom management, but also has positive impacts on students and their self-esteem and confidence, their EQ, and of course, their social skills. I want to show you today a 10-level scale of working classrooms that looks at similar sorts of themes in terms of control and warmth in the classroom. On the one hand, there is a rating of a 1, which is where the class is controlled by the students, and ultimately there's disengaged teachers. This may involve not being greeted when you walk in the classroom. There could be verbal call-outs and abuse towards you, and it's not a very conducive environment, of course, to learn in or teach in. On the other hand, there is a level of a 10, which is a high level of comfort and enjoyment in the classroom, and it's also both engaging for students and teachers. There is the middle ground as well, which is that it can be all right, but it could be better. The feelings here in each of these levels on the educator or yourself is that they range from being exhausted, that you can range from being exhausted, drained, not wanting to go to class, of course, to being completely relaxed and loving teachers, teaching the students and being in control, which has benefits not only for yourself, but also the students. Using this 10-level scale, I would like you to grab your worksheet for today and thinking about the scale, what would you rate yourself on the whole out of 10 in terms of how you would rate your classroom management? I'll just give you a moment to do that. So moving on to challenging and disruptive behaviours, we've obviously looked at how this can be the result and cause of different types of classroom management. So challenging and disruptive behaviours might look like the students talking over you. There may be a lack of respect for yourself and the peers in the classroom. Maybe that they're not prepared to listen. They may be fighting or bickering. They could call out answers. They could distract others, but also themselves. They could avoid doing work, and there could be disengagement. There has actually been a recent Senate inquiry in Australia into looking at disruptive student behaviour and these sorts of things we're talking about in terms of classroom disruption. They found that there's a great deal of low-level disruptive behaviour in Australia, particularly. And I would imagine at KRB, if any, it's that low level. So these are things such as talking unnecessarily and calling out without permission, being slow to start work or follow instructions, showing a lack of respect for each other and yourself, not bringing the right equipment, and using mobile phones inappropriately. On the flip side, there's of course a high level of disruptive student behaviour, and you may see this, but I'm sure that there probably wouldn't be a lot of this at KRB, which is property destruction, verbal abuse and threats, physical assaults, leaving school grounds and truancy, tantrums, and particularly substance abuse. Thinking about those sorts of challenging and disruptive behaviours, and given awareness is the first stage, I would like you just to reflect on your classrooms and what sorts of behaviours do you see? As mentioned, they probably would be more likely those low level, but you may see some high level. Just thinking about what are those ones you see and what are your main challenging behaviours. So what can we do about challenging and disruptive behaviours in students? Well, of course, there's some classroom management strategies, which I'm sure you're all across and you've done extensive theory in becoming a teacher. But from a psychological perspective, I will give you some that we find in the research. Just starting with, I would like you to just think about what do you do when you do have those disruptive students in class? What are your already go-to strategies? Just have a moment to think about what they might be. Here is a list of other strategies that you may be familiar with. So things like seating arrangements, separating students that are having a bad influence on each other, praising good behaviour when you do see it. And of course, that positive reinforcement we know is very advantageous. Establishing a very strong sense of routine. Having clear rules and expectations. And we'll look at this further in the third module within this student section of the webinar series. It may be that you go straight to the reprimanding and discipline, leave the classroom, I'm talking to your parents, etc. It may be that you pick up the pace of instruction, just keep going through the class. It may be providing your students with a choice. Well, you can either stay here and do this, or you can go off to the library and do something else. It could be involving the parents and having a meeting with them. Or it could be potentially empathizing and relating to them. So going into some more specific classroom management strategies. There's three particular ones or ways that I want to call out. So firstly, it's this idea of relating and moving towards the student. That's like that empathize option that we just saw before, which is not always our first point of call, but I will talk you through what that looks like and how we can potentially do that. Outsourcing, and who do you outsource to, and how you can help actually involve the fellow students in the classroom, so move outside themselves. And discuss as a third point of call, how do you ultimately move away from that exact classroom and take that offline? So starting with relate and moving towards. So this is many things that you can do to actually have more compassion for your students and understand, well, why are they disrupting and behaving in such a way? Greet by the name at the door. This seems like a very basic idea or strategy, but there's a huge amount of research in terms of why greeting at the door by name increases engagement for students, and it helps to keep them more almost accountable in the class, knowing that you've welcomed them in with a bit more rapport than perhaps you may have done. And it also ultimately can increase academic achievement by up to 20%. So something as simple as that is calling them out almost when they come in the classroom. Being enthusiastic to be a teacher, reflecting back on what we did in week one, which is, remember your why. So really channeling and leaning into that idea of being a teacher and why do you love it in the first place. Being enthusiastic to be there for to teach that day. Compliment achievements, as mentioned, positive reinforcement is often far more advantageous than negative punish or punitive punishment. So when they do things well, really complimenting them and praising. Engaging in small talk to build that rapport and genuine compassion and relationship with them. Listen actively, which we've looked at in the previous webinar series. So I would suggest you to go back and have a look at that again. And including some humour and warmth. I mean, after all, they're adolescents and they're teenagers. They also enjoy seeing a warmer side. We know that high level of warmth is very good as part of that authoritative style. You can still move towards them in that way, in a positive way. The benefits of doing all of this is that it makes you more approachable. It reduces their tendencies to do those off-task behaviours. As mentioned, that simple greet at the door has found in the research to increase academic achievement by up to 20%. You can empower students, you develop those more genuine connections, and it can those sorts of strategies can also, particularly the greet at the door, reduce disruptive behaviours by 10% at a minimum. So further to relate, looking at outsource. So move outside that particular student that's being disruptive. Sometimes it is more effective to target the class as a whole than specific individuals in the class. And we'll look at why this is. So what does this look like? It might be pausing your teaching, again, calling them out by name, and articulating the condition for resuming teaching. So for instance, sorry class, we can't move on until X person stops doing whatever they're doing, etc. What that does is that it pushes peer pressure to help with the classroom management. there'll be a huge portion of the classroom, I'm sure, who one, want to learn, and two, are probably sick of that sort of behaviour in the first place. So it helps to regulate their behaviour and creates more of a class-wide approach, which can be very advantageous. Of course, beyond that, outsourcing can look like moving outside the classroom or referring them outsourcing to further support, such as the psychology team and the counselling team at KRB. Finally, is about discussing and moving away. And notice it's discuss, not, for instance, reprimand or discipline. Our common management style is maybe to feel a little bit like this, or wanting to do some of this, that anger and frustration and just thinking, why can't they just stop? Or, I'm so sick of this behaviour. The danger of this is that, according to the research, this does not take into account students' emotions, of which there can be very complex. Of course, adolescents are going through very challenging times in their own lives, puberty being a quite obvious one, but also everything else that goes on at school and the school environment between friendship groups, social challenges, outside family concerns, things like that. So it doesn't factor in that. As we saw also, it actually decreases disruptive behaviour. So this has been found that by reprimanding and disciplining, that can decrease the chance of reducing that disruptive behaviour. It also doesn't actually increase student engagement. So it's counterintuitive, but it does the opposite. It will not get them engaged. It'll probably just create greater disdain and even lack of respect for potentially yourself and the whole classroom environment. So what it does look like, the research has found that clear written and verbal feedback on students' behaviour is far more effective. So moving them away from the classroom experience and saying, hey, can we catch up and have 5 minutes to just check in? I just want to understand what's going on. Using some of those skills that we've looked at previously, which is, the active listening, asking them those open questions to find out honestly what's happening, and then still giving them feedback based on observed feedback that you've seen in class. Better still than that is actually, according to research, is that two-way feedback. So saying, I can see that you're frustrated by being in my science class. What is it that I can do to help support you? Can you give me some feedback as well? And then also in that same conversation, giving them. That has been found to be the most effective way to help engage those disengaged and disruptive students. So things like this could look like is classroom monitoring, obviously recording specific instances, writing down that feedback, initiating and setting up a one-on-one meeting, using those observed behaviours, potentially getting parents involved when necessary, and definitely having that two-way feedback, so asking for their thoughts as well, which will, according to research, increase their likelihood of being engaged in the classroom. So finally, looking at your classroom management strategies. I want you to please recall what your current classroom management strategies are. Are any of these ones helpful to consider, or that you've already thought of, already do, or would like to consider? Or also, perhaps these, how can you relate more to your students? How can you help involve the class? And how can you help have a healthy, productive, two-way feedback session or discussion with them outside of the classroom experience? Just giving you a moment to bring out your worksheet and write down what are some of your current favourite classroom management strategies, or perhaps ones that you would like to try going forward based off this. So to summarise today, hopefully we learnt that classroom management has evolved and it's become far more difficult and still remains a huge concern for teachers. And this is due to including things like technology, COVID, and the rise of mental illness. Your style of classroom management may fall on that 10-level scale that we looked at, from a 1, zero control, unpleasant learning experience to a 10, much more relaxed and engaged, and for you and your students. Challenging and disruptive student behaviour can range from low level, the calling out, the talking, distracting others and self, to also high level abuse, truancy, substance abuse. Some general classroom management strategies are things like seating arrangements, clear expectations and rules, and reprimanding and disciplining. What I would urge you to perhaps consider are these more specific classroom management strategies, which is really relating to your students, understanding what's happening, move towards them, outsourcing to the peers in the classroom, help to have that class-wide approach, and finally, discussing via two-way feedback with them. As always, some resources for you. Please reach out to these contacts if you need them. And of course, Maximinds is available and you do have free access using KRB 2024. Finally, here are my contact details. Please do reach out if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, or if I can help in any way. And I hope you've enjoyed today's session.